Hello, my name is Listianing Rahayu from Politeknik Negeri Malang. Today I'm going to present my paper on teaching culture in English as an international language, which culture to teach. This is presented for IVICOLL 2020, hosted by Politeknik Negeri Malang. I want to start my presentation by talking about definition of EIL, or English as an international language. So according to Meki, English as an international language is a language of wider communication, which means that the communication takes place between a wider community. And then the second one, according to Sharivian, EIL comprises many varieties and therefore used for international communication. And last but not least, which is the most important point in EIL, is the notion that English has been transnationalized. It means that now English norms and also culture embedded in English language is more heterogeneous than it was in the past, and the norms and culture is emergent from the context where English is spoken and with whom the speakers speak the language. The next one is I want to talk about the EIL learning goals, because in this presentation, I'm focusing mainly on the learning EIL and also how, as a teachers, we can choose the materials we will use in the classroom. So the first learning goal of EIL is actually to communicate ideas and cultures successfully in multilingual setting, rather than to sound like native speakers. And then the second important learning goals is to include cultural information and values which are significant for the speakers involved in the intercultural communication. In this case, it means that the cultural information and values taught in the English language classroom is not only based on the single norms which belongs to native speakers, but the norms which will be used by the learners in the actual context. And when it comes to EIL components, we may want to refer to the two most important components in EIL. The first is there is no dominant accent in English as an international language. We know that the learners as a foreign learners usually show their accent, and maybe some of them are not happy with their L1 accented English, but actually in EIL there is no single dominant accent preferred. However, we may find that our learners have different perceptions toward this issue, such as these extracts that I found in previous research. The first is the case with a Japanese learners learning English, which say that I thought authentic English was the English of native speakers. It shows that he has the perception that English who was taught by non-native speaker or spoken by non-native speakers are not authentic English. And then the second one is from the more recent research conducted in Indonesian context, in which the participant mentioned that he was aspired to speak like a British because it sounds cool. I think this is similar case with my own students and maybe with your own students. When I ask them about the accent, which one the best accent or which accent they prefer, many of them mention that I want to sound like American. I think Australian accent is cool, yeah, etc. So we know that here the perception of the students are similar, yeah, toward the first language accented English, in which many of them are not happy with that. And then the second one is about the culture. In EIL, there is no dominant culture, which means that there is no longer monolithic view or monolithic model of English, which used to subscribe to native speaker or what we call inner circle. In this case, the culture included like I previously mentioned before by referring to Kirkpatrick and McKay, the culture that should be mentioned in our EIL class should be a great variety of cultures, which come from either native speaker or non-native speaker cultures. However, there is an issue that some of the students, especially EFL students, they have an extensive exposure of English culture from movies, music, and books that makes them think that the English culture means the culture of the inner circle, of the culture of native speakers. And the previous findings related to student and teachers' perception was found by Waluyo and Jarum. In their research, it was found that EFL learners were aware that they have L1 extended English. They are aware that their native tongue extended English was actually intelligible. However, many of them perceive it negatively and wants to sound like native speakers. And then another research finding was from Dharma and Rudianto, which found that EFL learners actually had positive attitude toward their own English accent. So in this case, some learners were okay with their L1 extended English. However, they appreciated native accent far more positively than non-native accent. So we know that there is a similarities between these two findings about the learner's perception toward English. And now we talk about the main points of this presentation, which is material inclusion in EIL context. When we talk about material inclusion in EIL context, we may want to talk about learning goals and some teaching aspect. The first is about clear learning goals. As a teacher, it is important for us to mention about the clear learning goals in our English class, which we adopt from Kanagaraja, who mentioned that English has been transnationalized, which means that there is heterogeneous cultural communication taking place in English as an international language. And the second point, which is very important when we want to include some materials in EIL context, is there is no more native speaker-like oriented learning outcomes. So yeah, it has to be reframed that the outcomes that we expect from our class is not to enable students to sound like native speakers, but for the students to be immersed and engaged in cross-cultural encounter. And then last but not least, this is very important about paradigm shift of native speakerism. We talked about this in the previous slide, how the students have perception toward English. So paradigm shift is one of the overarching goal of our EIL learning. And now let's move on to another important point when we talk about material inclusion. This is about the cultural information, because this presentation focusing mostly on cultural materials. So there are three categories of cultural information according to courtesy engine. The first is source culture materials. The second one is target culture materials. And the third one is the international target culture materials. In which I argue that the third one is the most relevant materials for learning. Now we will be talking about the first source culture materials. This is when you include the materials which comes from the learner's own culture. For example, in Indonesian context, when you teach English and want to include cultural materials, you will take this material from your own culture or the learner's own culture. And there are some advantages and disadvantages, of course. The first advantages of using solely learner's own culture is the learners can express cultural beliefs without having subscribed to native speaker cultural and pragmatic norms. This way, the students can express themselves, and they also can represent their local identity when using English. So they can still use English, but they can express themselves and identity as an Indonesian learner or Thai learners, for example. However, there is a drawback in including solely the source culture materials, which according to Mickey will limit the opportunity for cultural learning and cross-cultural encounter, because the learners are only exposed to single types of cultural materials. And in this case, Kirkpatrick mentioned the case of Asian learners, where the discussion about Anglo-Saxon culture or Western cultures are rare between these learners. So it is very important to include Asian context or Asian cultures when we teach English for Asian learners. And then the second one is target culture materials. So it comes from the culture of English-speaking countries that we usually call inner circle. In this case, we are aware that many ELT textbooks are produced by English-speaking countries, and that's why there is a concept of one size fits all. So the cultures adopted in these textbooks coming from the inner circle or the native speaker, which are usually not relevant to the context of where the English is learned. While it is important and appropriate to know about native speaker norms, and it may motivate learners who have integrative motivation. However, it can be overwhelming for some learners. So in this case, Kanagaraja observed one of the classroom in Sri Lanka and found that some learners are overwhelming with the exposure of too many target culture materials. And in terms of the teachers, some teachers may feel insecure to teach only the target culture materials because they think that they are not the expert, and they think that they lack of information about other cultures or the native speaker cultures. And then last but not least is the international target culture. So in the international target culture, there is a combination of different variety of cultures in both English and non-English speaking countries. For example, in Indonesian context, when I learn with my students about different cultures in English classroom, I will combine not only Indonesian culture or not only American culture or Australian culture, but I will combine a great variety of culture. Indonesian culture, Indian culture when English is spoken as a second language, Australian culture when English is the first language, and maybe Thai culture when English is spoken as a foreign language. This way, the students will express and share their own culture with both native and non-native speakers, but they also receive a lot of information about language or how English is used in a variety of encounters. And another important point of including international target culture is we will give the opportunity for our learners to learn English and use it more critically by not only accepting the norms, but by comparing and contrasting some different cultures and pragmatic norms. It is also to create mutual understanding and offers interesting cultural mirror for the learners. And it will also help them to develop their intercultural skills. And in this way, Kes and Selinker mentioned that it will help the learners separate issues about cross-cultural communication from issues of stereotype behavior, because they have a better understanding of culture, which is more holistic, and they know how language will be eventually used in their own context. I think that's all. My presentation today. If I may conclude that I will say that teachers need to choose relevant ELT materials by combining a great variety of cultures. And it is important to understand a great variety of cultures when we teach English, so our learners will get the opportunity to learn not only the language, but also the culture that they will be using in cross-cultural encounters. Thank you for listening to my presentation. I'll see you on the next IVICOLL or another conference. Thank you. Bye-bye.